The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. The roses were stones. Alone among the twisted woods, like a branch himself, restless among the rooted trees, he moved rapidly, the sound of his knees becoming day by day familiar to the birds and hares. Ribbed with the sunlight where the woodlands thinned, dark as shadows themselves, where no sun came, he moved as though pursued. For so long a time had he slept in the cold, lightless corridor that, waking, as it were, with no protection from the dawn, or stretching himself for sleep, defenceless before the twilight and sundown, he was at first unable to feel other than nakedness and awe. Nature, it seemed, was huge as Gormenghast. But as time went on, he learned to find the shortest and most secret ways of hill and woodland, of escarpment and marshland, to trace the winding of the river and its weed-bound tributaries. He realized that though the raw ache for the life he had lost was no less with him, yet the exertions he was obliged to make for his own preservation, and the call that such a life made upon his ingenuity, had their compensations. He learned day by day the ways of this new world. He felt proud of the 2 caves which he had found in the slopes of Gormenghast Mountain. He had cleared them of rocks and hanging weeds. He had built the stone ovens and the rock tables, the hurdling across their walls to discourage the foxes, and the beds of foliage. One lay to the south at the fringe of the unexplored country. It was remote and very thrilling to his bones, for the mountain lay between him and the far castle. The second cave was in the northern slope, smaller, but one which on rainy nights was more likely to prove accessible. In a glade of the twisted woods he had constructed a shack as his primary and especial home. He was proud of his growing skill at snaring rabbits, and of his successes with the net he had so patiently knotted with lengths of tough root fibre, and it was sweet to taste the fish he prepared and ate alone in the shadow of his shack. The long evenings were like blonde eternities, stifling and silent save for the occasional flutter of a wing or the scream of a passing bird. A stream, which had all but dried, moved past his doorway and disappeared in the shadows of the undergrowth to the south. His love for this lost glade he had selected grew with the development of a woodland instinct, which must have been latent in his blood, and with the feeling that he possessed something of his own, a hut he had made with his own hands. Was this rebellion? He did not know. The day over, he would sit at the door of his cabin, his knees beneath his chin, his bony hands clasping his elbows, and stare ruminatively, a stranger would have thought suddenly, before him as the shadows lengthened inch by inch. He had started to turn over in his mind the whole story of Gormenghast as it had affected him. Of Fuchsia, now that he could see her no longer, he found it painful to reminisce, for he missed her more than he could have imagined possible. The weeks went by and his skill grew, so that he had no longer to lie in wait for half a day at a time at the mouths of warrens, a club in his hand, nor waste long hours by the river fishing the less hopeful reaches for lack of lure. He could devote more and more of his time to conditioning his shack against the approaching autumn and inevitable winter, to exploring further afield, and to brooding into the evening sunlight. It was then that the vile nightmare memory would most often return. The shape of a cloud in the sky, the sight of a red beetle, anything might suddenly awake the horror, and he would dig his nails into the palms of his hands as the recollection of the murder and the subsequent death of his master discoloured his brain. There were few days in which he did not climb the foothills of the mountain, or pick his way to the edge of the twisted woods, in order to see the long broken line of Gormenghast's backbone. Hours of solitude in the woods were apt to detach him from the reality of any other life, and he would at times find that he was running gawkily through the boles in a sudden fear that there was no Gormenghast, that he had dreamt it all, that he belonged to nowhere, to nothing, that he was the only man alive in a dream of endless branches. The sight of that broken skyline, so interwoven with his earliest recollections, reassured him that though he was himself ejected and abandoned, yet all that had given him purpose and pride in life was there, and was no dream or fable, but as real as the hand which shielded his eyes, a reality of immemorial stone, where lived, where died, and where was born again the lit line of the Groans. On one such evening, after scanning the castle for some while, and moving his eyes at last across the coruscation of the mud huts, he rose to his feet and began his return journey to the glade, when suddenly changing his mind, he retracted 100 or so of his steps and set off to his left, penetrating with astonishing speed a seemingly impenetrable valley of thorns. These stunted trees gave way at length to sparser shrub, the leaves, which had all but fallen with drought, hanging to the brittled branches only by reason of the belated refreshments which the sudden storm had given to their roots on the night of the murder. The incline on either side could now be seen more clearly, and as Flay picked his way through the last barrier of shrubs, ash-coloured slopes lifted unbroken on his either hand, the grass as sleek and limp as hair, with not a pale blade upright. There was not a breath of wind. He rested himself, lying out upon his back on a hot slope to his right. His knees were drawn up, for angles were intrinsic to his frame in action or repose, and he gazed abstractedly over the small of his outstretched arm at the sheen on the grasses. He did not rest long, for he wished to arrive at his northern cave before dusk. He had not been there for some while, and it was with a kind of swart enjoyment that he surrendered to the sudden whim. The sun was already a far cry from its zenith, hanging in haze a few degrees above the horizon. The prospect from the northern cave was unusual. It gave Mr. Flay what he imagined must be pleasure. He was discovering more and more in this new and strange existence, this vastness so far removed from corridors and halls, burned libraries and humid kitchens, gave rise in him to a new sensation, this interest in phenomena beyond ritual and obedience, something which he hoped was not heretical in him, the multiformity of the plants and the varying textures in the barks of trees, the varieties of fish and bird and stone. It was not in his temperament to react excitedly to beauty, for as such it had never occurred to him. It was not in him to think in terms. His pleasure was of a dour and practical breed, and yet not altogether. When a shaft of light fell across a dark area, his eyes would turn to the sky to discover the rift through which the rays had broken. Then they would return with a sense of accomplishment to the play of the beams. But he would keep his eye upon them. Not that he supposed them to be worth looking at, imagining there was something wrong in himself for wasting his time in such a fruitless way. As the days went by, he had found that he was moving to and fro through the region in order to be at one place or another in time to watch the squirrels among the oaks at noon, the homecoming of the rooks, or the death of the day from some vantage point of his finding. And so it was this night that he wished to catch the crags as they blackened against the falling sun. It took him another hour of walking to reach the northern cave, and he was tired when he stripped himself of his ragged shirt and rested his back against the cool outer wall. He was only just in time, for the circle, like a golden plate, was balancing upon its rim on the point of the northernmost of the main crags of Gormenghast Mountain. The sky about it was old rose, translucent as alabaster, yet sumptuous as flesh, and mature as a soft skin or heavy fruit, for this was no callow experiment in zoneless splendour. This impalpable sundown was consummate, and the child of all the globe's archaic sundown since first the red eye winked. As the thin man's gaze travelled down the steep sides of this crag to the great, heart-shaped gulch beneath it, where what vegetation there was lay sunk in a sea of shade, he felt rather than saw, for his thoughts were still in the darkness, a quickening in the air about him, and lifting his head he noticed how, with a deepening of the rose in the sky, all things were tinted, as though they had awaited the particular concentration of hue which the sky now held, before admitting the opinions of their separate colours to be altered or modified. As at the stroke of a warlock's wand, the world was suffused. All things saving the sun, which, in contradiction to the colour of the vapours and the forms that it had raddled, remained golden. Flay began to untie his boots. Behind him his swept cave yawned, a million prawn-coloured motes swaying against the darkness at the entrance. He noticed, as he worked his heel free of the leather, that the crag was biting its way into the sun, and had all but reached its centre. He leant his bony head backwards against the stone, and his face became lit, and the stubble of his first beard shone, its every hair a thread of copper wire, as he followed the course of the crag's crest in its seemingly upward and arrow-headed journey, its black barbs eating outwards as it climbed. Inexorable as was its course, there was, that summer evening, more destiny in the progress of another moving form, so infinitesimal in the capacious mountain dusk, than in the vast sun's ample, spell-bound cycle. Through her, in microcosm, the wide earth sobbed. The star-globe sank in her, the colours faded, the death-dew rose, and the wild birds in their breast climbed to her throat and gathered songless, hovering, all tumult, wing to wing, so ardent for those climes where all things end. To Flay, it was as though the silence of his solitude had been broken, the senses invading each other's provinces, for on seeing the movement of something the size of the letter I, that moved in silhouette against the gigantic yellow plate, he had the sensation of waking from a dream which took hold of him. Distant as it was, he could tell it from a human form. That it was Kedar, it was not in his power to realize. He knew himself for witness. He could not stop himself. He knelt forward on his knees, while the movements melted one into the next. He grew more rigid. The tiny, infinitely remote figure was moving across the sun towards the crag's black edge. Impotently he watched, his jaw thrust forwards, and a cold sweat broke across his bony brow, for he knew himself to be in the presence of sorrow, and an interloper upon something more personal and secret than he had the right to watch, and yet impersonal, for in the figurette was the personification of all pain, taking, through sliding time, its final paces. She moved slowly, for the climb had tired her, and it had not been long since she had borne the child of clay, like alabaster, the earthless daughter who had startled all. It was as though Kedar was attached from the world, exalted and magnificently alone in the rose-red haze of the upper air. At the edge of the naked drop to the shades below she came to a standstill, and after a little while turned her head to Gormenghast and the dwellings afloat in the warm haze. They were unreal. They were so far, so remote. No longer of her they were over. Yet she turned her head for the child's sake. Her head turning was dimensionless. A thong about her neck supported the proud carvings of her lovers. They hung across her breasts. At the edge of age, there was a perilous beauty in her face as of the crag's edge that she stood upon. The last of footholds, such a little space. The colour fading on the 7-foot strip. It lay behind her like a carpet of dark roses. The roses were stones. There was one fern growing. It was beside her feet. How tall? 1,000 feet? Then she must have her head among far stars. How far all was! Too far for Flay to see her head had turned, a speck of life against that falling sun. Upon his knees he knew that he was witness. About her and below lay the world. All things were ebbing. A moon that climbed suddenly above the eastern skyline, chilling the rose, waned through her as it waxed, and she was ready. She moved her hair from her eyes and cheekbones. It hung deep and still as the shadow in a well. It hung down her straight back like midnight. Her brown hands pressed the carvings inwards to her breast, and as a smile began to grow, the eyebrows raised a little, she stepped outwards into the dim atmosphere, and falling, was most fabulously lit by the moon and the sun.